She walked in to quit. He locked the door and rewrote everything. 12 years of silent dedication. 12 years of being the one behind the scenes, fixing problems, holding people together, only to be forgotten. Eleanor Hayes was ready to walk away, not with bitterness, but with dignity. She wasn't looking for revenge. She wasn't even looking to be noticed. But someone was watching. James Whitmore III, CEO, billionaire, widower, known for being brilliant, ruthless, and utterly unreachable, until that day when the quiet woman with the trembling hands placed a letter on his desk, and something in him shifted. This isn't just a story of quitting. It's about the moment two people, both tired, both guarded, both quietly broken, finally saw each other. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or left behind, and if you've ever held back feelings for someone because the timing, the roles, or the scars felt too complicated, tell us below. Have you ever wanted to walk away, but stayed for the right reason? Now, lean in close. Let us tell you the story of the secretary who quit in tears. But the billionaire CEO locked the door and said, "You're mine." 12 years. That's how long Eleanor Hayes had given to this company. 12 years of arriving before the lights came on and staying after the cleaning crew had finished. 12 years of printing, proofreading, coordinating, calming, adjusting, absorbing, of being the person who always knew where the missing file was, when the meeting was, who needed what before they even asked. But tonight, as rain tapped gently against the tall windows of the fifth-floor office, her resignation letter glowed on the computer screen like quiet defiance. The cursor blinked, steady, patient, as if waiting for her to hit send. The building was nearly empty. It always was at this hour. Most of her co-workers had left by 6. Some had the luxury of families to go home to. Some had mastered the art of disconnecting. Eleanor had neither. What she had was the silence of a long hallway, the hum of a soda machine down the corridor, and the low buzz of the overhead lights, always slightly too warm for comfort. She stared at the letter. Her fingers rested on the keyboard, unmoving. The body of the message was direct, polite, professional. It took her nearly 2 hours to write it, though the words had been forming inside her for years. She leaned back in her chair, the worn leather creaking under her. The only light in the room came from her desk lamp and the glow of the monitor. Beyond the window, Charleston's skyline shimmered beneath a wet blur of raindrops. She used to love that view. Now, it looked like a painting she'd stared at too long, once breathtaking, now hollow. The final blow had come that morning. She had spent the better part of 3 weeks building out the strategic planning deck for the company's newest client, Coastal Haven Resorts. Dozens of hours analyzing market trends, surveying customer behaviors, adjusting every detail until it felt just right. The kind of work that required both instinct and precision. The kind of work she used to dream of doing. And when the internal presentation began, her name wasn't even on the first slide. It wasn't anywhere. Vanessa Pratt had taken the floor with perfect posture, perfect polish, and a perfectly rehearsed script. She clicked through Eleanor's slides, presented Eleanor's data, and answered questions with a practiced smile Eleanor knew well. Because she had written the answers. Not once did Vanessa glance Eleanor's way, not even a thank you when it ended. By 3 Suro P. Mum. Everyone in the room was celebrating a job well done. Vanessa even received a congratulatory email from James Whitmore III himself, the elusive CEO who rarely praised anyone directly. Eleanor sat at her desk with a paper cup of lukewarm tea, staring at her inbox. Not one message, not a nod, not even a whisper of acknowledgement. And just like that, something in her had settled, not snapped, not screamed, just quietly folded in on itself, like the final corner of a paper crane. Complete. She glanced now at the letter again, then at the tiny desk clock, 8:17 p.m. 12 years. She thought about the little sacrifices, the Sunday evenings lost to proofreading annual reports, the time she missed her goddaughter's recital to cover an investor dinner last minute, the quiet promotions given to others with the same quiet reasoning, you're so good at what you do where you are, as if excellence were a cage. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and stood slowly, the weight of fatigue settling in her joints. Her eyes burned not with tears, but with the ache of accumulated restraint. She clicked print. The printer beside the filing cabinet whirred to life. A single sheet of crisp white paper slid out. The words looked so final in ink. She folded the letter neatly, slipping it into an ivory envelope she had brought from home. It was the kind with a real flap, not self-adhesive. She sealed it carefully, pressing the edge closed with the back of her thumbnail. Across the front, she wrote in steady cursive, James Whitmore III. Personal. The quiet of the office seemed to deepen. She didn't know what she expected from handing it in personally. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. She placed the envelope inside her leather tote, the one she'd carried since her 3rd year at the company. The same bag that had once held lunch notes from her father when he was still alive. The same bag that had been with her through every client pitch, every late night, every quiet heartbreak. Eleanor turned off the desk lamp. The darkness felt like an exhale. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the knob. Tomorrow, she whispered, the word barely a breath. I'll hand this in myself. And for the first time in years, her voice didn't shake. People say loyalty is a virtue, but in Eleanor's world, it became a cloak for invisibility. 12 years ago, she walked into Whitmore Group with a pressed blouse, a fresh degree, and a heart full of quiet determination. She didn't want the corner office. She wasn't chasing titles. What she wanted was simple to belong somewhere that valued thoughtful work and honest effort. At first, that seemed possible. The early days were filled with late-night document runs, color-coded binders, and the rush of being the one who could get it done. Eleanor quickly became the dependable one. The one you went to when you couldn't find a file or needed something proofread 5 minutes before the client call. She always said yes, always smiled, always delivered. It didn't take long before her desk became the unofficial nerve center of the floor. Everyone knew Eleanor would stay late. Everyone knew she'd make sure things didn't fall through the cracks. But somewhere along the way, that reliability stopped being admired and started being expected. She wasn't offered leadership training. She wasn't invited to development retreats. New hires were onboarded without her input, despite her knowing more about the workflows than anyone in middle management. She became the steady one, the background, the one who made everyone else look polished without ever shining herself. And then came Vanessa. Vanessa Pratt arrived at Whitmore Group with sleek hair, sharp heels, and an even sharper smile. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and people leaned in. Charismatic, articulate, always a step ahead in both fashion and office politics. At first, Eleanor liked her. Vanessa seemed approachable. She complimented Eleanor's organizational systems, asked her opinion on presentation formats, even brought her coffee once during a stressful week. They had lunch together once, maybe twice. There were jokes about being the only 2 women in a room full of suits. It was easy to feel seen, but slowly. The compliments faded. The smiles became shorter. The requests more pointed. Vanessa began asking Eleanor to take a quick look at her slide decks, then presenting them as her own. She'd forward client memos with vague instructions. Can you clean this up for me? And when the ideas impressed the board, She never corrected the assumption that they were hers. Eleanor hesitated at first. She thought maybe it was just a miscommunication. Maybe Vanessa meant to give her credit and forgot. Maybe next time. But next time never came. Soon, Vanessa was the rising star. She was featured in internal newsletters, quoted in press releases, whispered about in hallways as the future face of the company. She handled clients with charm, but the foundation of her success, data analysis, strategy notes, logistical planning, often came from documents Eleanor had prepared late into the night. Still, Eleanor said nothing. She told herself it didn't matter, that the work was being used, that results were what counted. But the silence took its toll. Meetings became harder. Vanessa stopped inviting her altogether. When Eleanor gently inquired why she wasn't looped in on the Coastal Haven planning session, Vanessa smiled thinly and said, "It was a tight group, nothing personal." When the same thing happened again the following month, Eleanor realized she'd been systematically excluded, not through outright dismissal, but through omission, which was somehow worse. There was one afternoon 6 months before this night when the shift became undeniable. Eleanor had just handed Vanessa a neatly bound report outlining a marketing pivot for a declining product line. She had poured her heart into it, digging through demographic patterns and cross-referencing regional performance metrics. As she handed it over, Vanessa didn't even glance at it. She just smiled and said, "You know, Eleanor, not everyone is built to be in the spotlight. Some people are better as background support. Don't you think?" It was said with a soft tone, almost kind, as if it were a compliment, but it landed like a slap. That night, Eleanor went home and didn't open her laptop for the first time in years. She lay on her couch in the quiet, watching ceiling shadows shift with passing headlights, and wondered how long she had been standing still, how long she had let herself shrink so that others could stretch. She told herself it was just the way of the world, that not everyone needed to be at the front of the room. But the truth was more painful. She had allowed herself to be invisible because she believed it made her irreplaceable. Now, sitting at her desk with the office finally empty, that lie no longer held weight. She looked down at the envelope resting beside her keyboard. Ivory, thick, the kind she used to buy when she wrote real letters back when her father was still alive, and she'd send him updates from college. She slid the printed resignation letter inside, folding the flap with care. Her fingers lingered on the crease, the motion as deliberate as it was final. Tomorrow, she would climb the stairs to the executive floor. Tomorrow, she would hand this in. But tonight was for remembering, for honoring the invisible years, the ones she gave away without asking for anything in return. She slipped the envelope into her bag, zipped it closed with a quiet firmness, and turned off her monitor. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped, but inside her, something finally had. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual, or maybe it was just the weight of 12 silent years pressing down on her shoulders. Eleanor stood near the back of the elevator, her hands clasped in front of her, the envelope tucked tightly under one arm. The mirrored walls reflected her composed exterior navy blouse, black slacks, hair neatly pinned, a professional image she had perfected over the years. But beneath that, a quiet storm churned. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, or perhaps it was what it represented: finality, truth, the line between being seen and being overlooked for the last time. She had been to the top floor before, but only to deliver documents, drop off catered lunches, or discreetly place agendas on polished conference tables. She had never walked into the CEO's office as herself, not as Eleanor Hayes, a woman with something to say, but always as someone doing a task for someone else. But not today. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened to a corridor lined with wood-paneled walls and soft amber sconces. The carpet beneath her heels muffled every step as she walked toward the double doors at the far end, the doors few dared to knock on. The hallway smelled faintly of old books and cedar, the kind of scent that belonged in a grandfather's study or an old southern library, comforting in its own way, solid, timeless. She paused before the frosted glass doors etched with delicate gold lettering. James Whitmore III, Chief Executive Officer. Her fingers brushed over the envelope in her hand, just once. Then she knocked. A moment passed. Then a low voice, warm but measured, answered from within. "Come in." She opened the door slowly. The office was larger than she remembered, not ostentatious, but elegant in its restraint. Walls lined with built-in bookshelves held hard covers in deep jewel tones. A grandfather clock ticked softly in one corner. There were paintings not modern art, but seascapes and pastoral scenes, as if to suggest legacy over trend. Behind the wide mahogany desk, James Whitmore III looked up from his laptop. He wore a gray vest over a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, tie loosened at the collar. The kind of man who always looked like he had already read tomorrow's headlines. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw her. "Miss Hayes," he said, standing. "This is unexpected." She gave a small nod, but didn't smile. "I won't take much of your time, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, her voice clear, steady. He gestured toward the two chairs across from his desk. "Please, sit." Eleanor took the seat closest to the window. From here, the view of Charleston stretched endlessly, gray rooftops, winding rivers, the shimmer of distant marshes under morning rain. She didn't look at the view. She looked at him. "I wanted to give you this directly," she said, placing the envelope on the desk between them. Her fingers brushed its edge one last time before pulling back. He glanced at it, but didn't pick it up. There was a pause. Then he leaned forward, folding his hands together. "I assume this is what I think it is." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a breath, deep, grounding. And then she spoke. "I've worked here for 12 years. She began, eyes steady on his. "I've handled everything from executive schedules to last-minute pitch decks. I've taken phone calls at midnight. I've rewritten proposals hours before submission. I've shown up early. I've stayed late. I've watched new hires leapfrog over me. I've listened to my ideas come out of other people's mouths, dressed in their voices." James didn't interrupt. He didn't move. "I stayed because I believed in the work, in this company. I thought that if I just kept showing up, someone would eventually notice, that I wouldn't have to raise my hand to be seen." She paused, but still no tears came. "I'm not here to complain," she added softly. "I'm here because it took me too long to realize that loyalty, on its own, doesn't earn respect. And I can't keep giving my energy to a place that won't give it back." Her words didn't echo, but they filled the room. Still, James didn't reach for the envelope. He studied her face instead, searching, perhaps for bitterness, for drama, for emotion too raw to manage. But he found none. Just a woman sitting across from him with more calm than resignation, more strength than sorrow. When she finally stood, she straightened her shoulders, not as someone who had lost something, but as someone who had decided not to give any more of herself away. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice quiet but whole. James nodded once, but said nothing. Eleanor walked to the door without looking back. and when the latch clicked softly behind her, James remained seated. He looked at the envelope sitting on his desk, still unopened, still white and pristine, untouched by time or decision. He frowned, not out of annoyance, but out of something far less familiar. Regret. It was just a quiet afternoon, until James Whitmore decided to dig into the project records. The rain had let up. Outside, the clouds still hung low over Charleston, casting a pewter haze across the skyline. But the storm inside his office had passed. Eleanor was gone. The envelope remained. James hadn't opened it. Not yet. Instead, it sat untouched on the corner of his desk, as if waiting for him to be ready. But he wasn't. What stayed with him wasn't the letter. It was her voice, not angry, not pleading, just clear, too clear. It had been a long time since someone spoke to him like that, not with deference, not with calculation, but with quiet conviction. He wasn't sure if it unnerved him or impressed him. Maybe both. He found himself opening the company archive that afternoon without really planning to. He clicked through project folders from the last 5 years, searching for something he couldn't quite name. The company's biggest campaigns, their turnarounds, their innovations. One by one, he opened decks, briefs, strategy outlines. He knew most of the names attached to them, department heads, team leads, rising stars like Vanessa Pratt, the faces that appeared in meetings and reports. But as he dug deeper into the draft histories, a pattern began to emerge. There it was, in the metadata. E. Hayes, not on the title slide, not listed as lead, but always in the document history. In the early versions, in the footnotes. She wasn't the voice in the room. She was the architect behind the words. He opened the Seabreeze campaign, the one that had revived their stagnant hospitality accounts. He remembered how Vanessa had dazzled the board with her presentation. But here, buried in an early draft, he found a different author. Eleanor's name, her phrasing, her market insights, worded without flourish, but with precision. He kept going. The Green Line Pivot Deck, one of their most applauded sustainability efforts, also began with a file owned by E. Hayes. She had built the bones of it. Someone else had given it skin. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the screen like it had turned into a mirror that showed him something he hadn't dared see. How many times had she built the thing, only to be erased from the celebration? He clicked open another document, a strategy memo for a client they'd eventually lost, but one whose early feedback had sparked later product changes. Eleanor had sent it directly to the executive inbox months ago. He hadn't read it, or perhaps he had, but too quickly. There was a line in the introduction that caught his breath now. Sometimes the best solutions aren't louder. They're simply better. He read the sentence again. It wasn't poetic. It was practical, clear, true. And now it felt haunting. He scrolled through the rest of the memo, detailed, thoughtful, with 3 alternate directions and contingency planning that mirrored the very model they now used. At the time, it had been passed over. Now, it read like a blueprint for everything they'd grown into. He sat still for a long time, the screen glowing in the early dusk. In all his years running the company, he had trained himself to see the people who made waves, the ones who spoke up, demanded attention, presented confidently. But Eleanor had never been that kind of storm. She was the tide. Quiet, constant, unnoticed until it shifted everything. He pulled up one more folder, internal proposals, found a list of campaign ideas dated 2 years ago, a folder named Revival Concepts, EH Drafts. It was her. He opened them, one by one. His eyes moved faster now, scanning for patterns, and they were all their seeds of the programs they now praised. some nearly identical, others reshaped, but undeniably rooted in her suggestions. He leaned forward and printed 3 of the documents. As the printer came to life beside his desk, spitting out crisp white pages, he rubbed a hand over his face. The familiar hum of the machine echoed in the quiet. How had he missed this, he, who prided himself on noticing what others overlooked, on cultivating talent, not just charisma? He walked to the printer and gathered the pages, flipping through them slowly. Not just good ideas, not lucky guesses. This was strategic thinking, vision, the kind people got promoted for. Except she hadn't. She'd been passed over, silently, repeatedly. And she'd stayed, all those years, until yesterday. He set the pages down, then looked at the envelope still resting on the edge of his desk, unopened, still. James stood up and crossed the room, staring out through the tall windows toward the sea. The light was beginning to fade, and the reflection of his own face met him in the glass, older now, more lined, more weary. He thought of her words. Loyalty, on its own, doesn't earn respect. He picked up the phone and pressed the intercom. "Lena," he said, voice low but firm. "Clear my schedule tomorrow morning." A pause crackled on the line. "All of it." "Sir, all of it." He glanced down at the printed pages on his desk. "I need to speak with someone." Eleanor was ready to pack her desk. She wasn't ready to be called back upstairs. The early morning still hung quiet around the office, with only the soft hum of overhead lights and the faint sound of a copier churning somewhere in the background. The kind of silence she had grown familiar with, where people avoided eye contact, kept their heads down, and busied themselves with everything but conversation. She liked it this way today, because today she was letting go. Her desk was half-packed. A cardboard box from the supply closet now held 12 years of carefully curated normalcy, her favorite pens, a coffee mug that said, "Don't ask." "I'm busy," a photo of her and her niece from a beach trip 5 summers ago, a few notebooks, a plant that had somehow survived all those forgotten weekends. She had folded her resignation letter and left it with Mr. Whitmore himself. The hard part was done. She had no expectations, no farewell lunch, no words of regret from those who had learned to walk past her without truly seeing her. She had made peace with it. Or so she thought. The phone on her desk rang. Not her cell phone. The office line. She hadn't heard it ring in months. She stared at it a moment before picking up. "Eleanor Hayes," she answered. It was Lena. "Mr. Whitmore's assistant, Mr. Whitmore would like to see you," she said gently. "This morning, if you're available." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "I didn't think there was anything else to discuss. He asked me to tell you it's not about the resignation. He just wants to speak with you. No pressure, no pressure." Eleanor hung up slowly. Her heartbeat had quickened, not out of excitement, but uncertainty. This was not how quiet exits worked. You didn't get summoned upstairs after resigning, not unless there was a problem or a misunderstanding. She slipped on her navy blazer, more from habit than necessity. Her reflection in the dark computer monitor showed a woman who had learned to appear composed even when everything beneath the surface churned. The elevator ride to the top floor felt different this time, not heavy like yesterday, but oddly suspended, like she was caught in the space between something ending and something unexpected beginning. When the doors opened, she was met not by a receptionist, but by the warm silence of a hallway she knew too well. She walked with practiced grace, heels softly tapping against the carpet as she approached the CEO's office once more. Mr. Whitmore stood at the window when she entered, sleeves rolled up, vest buttoned, reading glasses hanging from one hand. He turned, his expression unreadable, but not cold. "Miss Hayes," he said, "thank you for coming." She gave a polite nod, but didn't smile. He gestured to the small round table near his bookshelves, not his desk. A folder sat neatly on top, as if placed there with purpose. "I'll be brief," he said, "though I admit this is long overdue." She didn't sit. He continued anyway. "Yesterday, I took a walk through the last 5 years of our records. Campaigns, proposals, internal reports. In every successful project, your name appeared, quietly, consistently, but rarely in bold." Her hands tensed at her sides. "I found outlines in your voice, drafts with your logic, insights I once thought came from others. But now I realize they started with you." He paused, then motioned toward the folder. "I've created a new role, one that reflects the strategic mind behind what we've accomplished. It's called Executive Strategic Advisor. You would report directly to me." Eleanor blinked. She crossed the room slowly and sat down. She opened the folder, expecting, well, she didn't know what she expected, but not this. The role, the scope, the compensation. It was more than recognition. It was restoration. Her voice was soft. "Why now?" James remained standing. "Because I finally saw what was always there. Because too often, the right people wait quietly while the wrong ones speak louder." "You waited too long. I should have noticed sooner." Eleanor stared at the words before her, printed clearly, officially. The weight of the folder in her lap felt steadier than the resignation letter she'd handed over. And yet, she didn't feel triumphant. There was no swell of victory, no imagined applause in her mind. There was only stillness and the fragile beauty of being seen. "I'm not asking you to say yes today," he added. "I only ask that you believe this isn't about guilt or optics. This role exists because it should have long ago." She closed the folder gently, her fingers brushing its edge like it might disappear if she touched it too hard. And then she looked at him, not as the man in charge, not as the one who had overlooked her for years, but as someone who, even if belatedly, had tried to make something right. "I'll accept," she said, voice steady. But it wasn't for the title. It wasn't for the pay. It was because, for the first time, she wasn't being asked to stay invisible. Later that night, Eleanor walked home beneath the soft lamplight of Charleston's old streets. The air smelled of rain and blooming magnolias, and her heels made soft echoes on the cobblestones. She didn't smile widely, but the corners of her lips curved, just slightly. Not because she had won, but because someone had finally looked up and truly seen her. The office was smaller than the executive suite, but it had a door, a window, and her name on it. For Eleanor, it was more than enough. Her name, Eleanor Hayes, etched neatly on a brushed brass plaque outside the door, made her pause the first time she saw it. Not out of vanity, but because after years of anonymity, the recognition felt almost surreal. She ran her fingers lightly across the metal, then turned the knob and stepped inside. The space was quiet, bright, and simply furnished. A desk, a standing lamp, 2 chairs, and a window that overlooked the Charleston rooftops. The walls were still bare, waiting for her to decide who she was becoming. A fresh start didn't need to be dramatic. Sometimes it just needed sunlight and space to breathe. She took her time settling in, arranging her notebooks, a framed photo of her father, a ceramic vase her niece had made in art class, little pieces of the life that had existed outside those walls, now quietly moving in. What surprised her wasn't the office. It was how people treated her once she was in it. At the next strategic meeting, her seat was no longer at the far end of the table. scribbling notes no one would read. She was beside James, and when he introduced her, his tone was clear. "This is Eleanor Hayes, Executive Strategic Advisor. She'll be weighing in on every major initiative moving forward." Then he turned to her. "Eleanor, would you mind starting us off for a split second?" The room blurred. A ripple of silence. A familiar fear. What if I stumble? What if I say too much? But the quiet passed, and she spoke, not loudly, not theatrically, just clearly. She offered insight on a product launch timeline, raised a question no one had thought to ask about regional demographics. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was hers, and they listened. People took notes when she spoke. The first time it happened, she almost laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was new. James stopped by her office later that week, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "Figured we could skip the formal email chain," he said, setting a cup on her desk. At first, his visits were brief 5, maybe 10 minutes. Check-ins about a pitch, a report, a decision coming down from the board, but the edges of their conversations began to soften. One afternoon, after discussing Q2 projections, he stayed a little longer. He glanced at the photo of her father on her shelf. "Is that your dad?" She nodded, smiling faintly. "He was a school principal, quiet kind of man, used to say. When no one listens to you, start by listening to them." James leaned back in the chair across from her, eyes thoughtful. "That explains a lot," he said. "You see more than most." Eleanor wasn't sure how to respond, so she didn't. She let the quiet fill the room like sunlight through a window left open. It was later that month when she noticed Lily, a junior coordinator in branding. Lily was sharp, attentive, but lately seemed withdrawn in meetings, always present, never speaking. The signs were small, avoiding eye contact, flinching slightly when her supervisor raised his voice, holding her breath during pauses in conversation. Eleanor recognized it, the practiced invisibility, the subtle shrinking. After one meeting, Eleanor lingered by the elevator just long enough to catch Lily. "You had an idea about the Gen Z campaign, didn't you?" she asked gently. Lily blinked. I mean, yes. "But I didn't want to interrupt." "You weren't interrupting," Eleanor said. "You were contributing." Lily's eyes darted away. "It's just, my team lead doesn't really invite input." Eleanor paused, choosing her words. "When I was in your shoes," she said, "I spent years waiting for someone to ask for my thoughts. One day, I realized if I didn't speak up, no one would know I had any." Lily looked at her, silent. "But I also know," Eleanor added, "how powerful it can be when even one person believes in you." "So here I am." Lily gave a small, disbelieving smile. "You actually noticed me." "I did," Eleanor replied. "I do." The following week, Lily spoke up in a team meeting. Her voice trembled at first, but her idea landed. Others nodded. Her supervisor didn't interrupt. And afterward, she passed Eleanor in the hallway, hesitating. "Thank you," she said, her voice hushed. "I didn't think anyone noticed." Eleanor smiled. "I used to feel the same." That evening, Eleanor stayed late, not out of obligation, but because the office had grown into something more than work. It was a space that reflected not just position, but presence. She stood by the window as dusk fell, watching the city shift from day to evening. Streetlights blinked on one by one, and in a building across the street, someone played piano with the windows open. Life was happening everywhere, and finally, so was hers. She turned back to her desk, where fresh folders waited, Ideas she had the authority to guide. Voices she could help amplify. A younger version of herself, somewhere in this same company, was finally being heard. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just existing in the margins, she was rewriting them. By the third week in her new role, Eleanor Hayes had begun to feel something unfamiliar ease. She no longer walked with her eyes lowered, her steps were steady. Her name was called in meetings without surprise or dismissal. And when she spoke, people listened, but in the corridors, not everyone clapped. It started with whispers. "She's always in the CEO's office. Funny how she got promoted without an announcement. Pretty face. Private meetings. You do the math." Eleanor pretended not to hear, but rumors have a way of turning down your joy and turning up your doubt. At first, it was easy to dismiss. She told herself it was jealousy, growing pains. The shift from invisibility to authority would always come with discomfort for her and for others. But the whispers kept growing. Emails stopped including her. Meetings were rescheduled last minute. Vanessa, once politely distant, was now visibly cold. She smiled when others were watching, but behind closed doors, her silence was like frost. Then came the quarterly report. It was a document Eleanor had spent weeks preparing an in-depth analysis of their Southeast regional performance and expansion potential. Data reviewed line by line, projections refined, wording deliberate. She had submitted the draft 2 days early. When the final version was presented, Eleanor noticed the changes instantly. Key figures had been shifted. Her conclusions were distorted, risk levels minimized, and her name was still on it. The presentation went ahead. The board approved a decision based on faulty numbers. By the time Eleanor could speak to anyone, it was too late. She went straight to her office, checked her files. Her draft was gone. Nothing in her sent folder. Her work had been tampered with, silently replaced. And now the blame was heading her way. The next morning, she was summoned to a closed-door meeting with James, Vanessa, and 2 board members. Let's keep this brief. Vanessa began. Her tone was cool, almost performative. "There are concerns about the accuracy of your report. Eleanor." Eleanor kept her expression neutral. "That was not the version I submitted." James glanced at her. "Do you have a copy of the original I did?" "It's missing from my system." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Convenient. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she didn't react. Years in the background had taught her that silence was often mistaken for weakness, but sometimes silence revealed character. "I'm not sure what happened," Eleanor said calmly, "but I stand by the draft I submitted." That evening, James stayed late in his office. He pulled the IT logs, reviewed the file access history, called the data analytics manager himself. Within 2 hours, he had the truth. The file had been edited after Eleanor's submission. The edits came from Vanessa's assistant's credentials. He didn't speak to Eleanor that night. He called a meeting instead. The next morning, the entire executive team gathered. James stood at the front. No notes, no slides, just a quiet command. "I've reviewed the file metadata from last week's quarterly report," he said. "It shows unauthorized edits made after submission. The final version did not come from Eleanor Hayes. There were murmurs. He let them settle. This company does not rise on silence, and it will not fall to sabotage. Ms. Hayes earned her position. Anyone who suggests otherwise is not challenging her. They're challenging the standards we claim to uphold." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he walked out, the room was stunned into stillness. Vanessa didn't say a word. Eleanor, seated near the back, kept her hands folded in her lap. She didn't smile, but her eyes met James's as he passed her. And in that glance there was something unspoken, not gratitude, something older. a memory of dignity returning, but the damage had taken root deeper than even James expected. Eleanor did not return to her office that afternoon, or the next day, or the one after that. Her desk remained untouched. The little photo of her father still sat on the shelf. Her coffee mug, clean and dry, waited beside the keyboard. James paused outside her door on the third morning. The hallway was quiet, filtered with spring light. A faint breeze from a nearby open window stirred the papers on her desk. He didn't go in. He just stood there, holding a mug of coffee she never came to claim. Something in him tightened. She had finally been seen, and now she had vanished. He looked down the hallway, busy, bright, full of motion, but something essential was missing, and this time he felt it. He thought he had already lost too much in life. He wasn't ready to lose her, too. James Whitmore thought he understood absence. He'd buried both parents before he turned 40, lost the woman he once planned to build a life with, watched colleagues retire, vanish, or fade quietly into irrelevance. Absence was nothing new. He wore it like a tailored suit, sharp, discreet, and necessary. But Eleanor's absence was different. 3 days. That's all it had been. Yet her empty office felt like an echo chamber, magnifying everything unspoken between them. Her chair was still tucked in, coffee mug clean, the small photo of her father still standing silently on her desk. It wasn't just absence, it was the feeling that something essential had been removed, like a candle blown out before its flame could light the room. James had been distracted before. He'd missed things, important things. He'd seen that now, too clearly. And for the first time in years, he couldn't hide behind his title. He was worried, not just for the company, not for the board's questions or the unfinished reports. He was worried about her, the way her shoulders had carried invisible weights, the things she never said in meetings, but that he could feel between every line she wrote. And more than anything, he missed her presence. That morning, unable to focus, James found himself wandering down to the lower archives, an old habit when thoughts became too heavy. The records room was cold and quiet, filled with the scent of dust and faded ambition. He ran his fingers along the spine of a binder labeled Strategic Proposals, 2013. Tucked in the back, he found a blue folder, slightly wrinkled with time. He opened it slowly. It was hers. A mid-market expansion proposal, brilliant, methodical, and years ahead of its time. Eleanor had written this when she was still a junior secretary, working weekends, never asking for recognition. She'd sent it to his office once. He'd skimmed it, filed it, forgotten it. Until now. The recommendations she'd made, they had become the foundation of their most profitable division. He stared at her name, typed neatly on the front page. No title, no signature, just Eleanor Hayes, invisible, yet holding the future in her hands. He closed the folder slowly, like closing the cover of a book that deserved more readers, and for the first time in a long time, James felt ashamed. The elevator chimed just before noon. He didn't look up, not until a soft knock came. Not sharp, not urgent, familiar. I hope I didn't miss anything important. His head snapped up. Eleanor stood in the doorway. There was no dramatics, no announcement, just her. Hair swept back, a scarf tied at her neck. Calm eyes, softer now, grounded. "You're here," he said, breath catching more than expected. She stepped in. "My father had a fall. Nothing serious, but he needed me. I needed to go home." James stood, uncertain whether to move toward her or stay still. He settled for standing. "I saw your office. Every day. I left it just as it was," she said quietly. "Didn't want to pack anything. I wasn't done." His shoulders lowered. "You didn't resign," he said, more a statement than a question. "No." A pause, "But I considered it." He nodded, not pressing. "I've been silent for too long, James. I thought if I worked hard enough, long enough, someone would eventually notice. But silence doesn't earn you space. It just keeps you small. And now I've remembered who I was before I learned to disappear." James smiled, then walked over to his desk and picked up the blue folder. "I read this. 10 years ago. You had the company's future mapped out, and I didn't see it. I didn't see you." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "I wrote that on a Sunday, with a borrowed laptop and cold tea on my windowsill. I didn't think anyone would ever read it. I should have," he said, "and I should have said something then. But I'm saying it now." She looked at him, something soft flickering behind her gaze. "You once told me your father taught you to listen when others don't," he added. She smiled. He also said, "Don't disappear just to make others comfortable." I forgot that for a while. James walked closer. "Are you back, Eleanor?" She met his eyes, steady and certain. "I never left who I was. I'm just done hiding her." Then she tilted her head, half a smile playing at her lips. "And no, I'm not going anywhere. Mr. Whitmore." For once, he didn't correct her title. He just smiled back. Not every love story needs fireworks. Some need only silence, a river, and two people who finally see each other. James suggested the Riverwalk late in the day, when the office had begun to quiet and the sunlight stretched long across the floors. He didn't say it as a question. It was more like a quiet offering. Eleanor nodded. She needed air, too. The path along the Ashley River curved gently through old magnolia trees, past wooden benches worn smooth by time. Spanish moss hung low from branches like old memories. The breeze was cool, but not cold, just enough to make her pull her sweater a little closer. They walked side by side in silence at first. Not the stiff silence of strangers or colleagues, but the kind that holds room for breath, for noticing things: the creak of boats rocking at the dock, the scent of water and pine, the softness of gravel underfoot. It was James who spoke first. "Anne and I used to walk here every Sunday morning." Eleanor glanced at him, but said nothing yet. "We'd grab coffee from that little place on East Bay, the one with the chipped blue awning, and come here before the city got noisy." His voice didn't tremble, but there was a thinness to it, like parchment worn at the folds. "She passed away 9 years ago next week," he said, eyes fixed ahead. "Brain aneurysm, no warning." One moment she was talking about what we'd plant in the garden that spring, and the next... He stopped walking. Eleanor waited. "I didn't come back to this path for years," he said. It felt like sacred ground, or maybe just hollow. There were no easy words to offer. She didn't try. Instead, she gently said, "You loved her?" He nodded. "Yes. And after she died, I poured everything I had into the company. It was easier to be needed than to be lonely." They resumed walking, slower this time. "I used to think if I worked hard enough," he continued, "built something big enough, I wouldn't have to feel so untethered. But lately, I've realized something." He looked at her. "Even success is lonely, if you don't share it." Eleanor's throat tightened. She looked down at her hands, then at the river. "I never married," she said after a moment. "There was a man, once, long ago. But then, my father fell ill, and I moved back home. My world became doctor's visits, medication schedules, trying to keep the roof from leaking when the rain came too hard." She smiled faintly. Romance didn't stand a chance. James didn't interrupt. "I lost friends, lost time. Some days, I even lost myself, but I never regretted it. He was my father, and when he passed last year, she exhaled slowly. It was like losing a part of my own foundation. They stopped at a bench that faced the river. He gestured gently, and they sat. Eleanor rested her hands in her lap. I think, she said quietly, that I stopped believing I was allowed to want more. It felt selfish to dream when I'd been so long in survival mode. James was silent for a beat, then, softly, I see you now. Eleanor, I don't know how I missed it before, but I see you. She turned to him slowly, her eyes meeting his, not the guarded glance of workplace politeness, but the full, open look of someone who had spent a lifetime being half seen and was, for once, fully witnessed. He reached for her hand. His fingers were warm. She didn't pull away. The wind moved gently around them. Boats bobbed out in the marina, and somewhere, a dog barked. The world kept spinning. But here, in this moment, everything felt still. James drew in a breath. I don't want to run this company without you, he said. Not as my secretary, not even just as my advisor. She looked at him, searching his face. I want you beside me as my partner. His voice didn't falter. He wasn't selling a dream or dressing it in charm. It was simply the truth, as steady and solid as the bench beneath them. I don't know what it all looks like yet, he continued, but I know it's better with you in it, not behind me, beside me. Eleanor blinked, but no tears came. Just a quiet fullness in her chest, like something she didn't know she was carrying had finally been set down. She didn't answer, but her hand stayed in his, and when the breeze swept up again, rustling the reeds at the water's edge, James didn't speak. He just leaned back on the bench, their shoulders almost touching. The sun dipped lower, bathing the river in gold, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. 12 years ago, Eleanor Hayes sat behind the table. Today, she stood at the head of it. The ballroom of the Charleston Grand Hotel was filled with soft light and the gentle murmur of anticipation. Rows of chairs lined up before a stage framed by white lilies and a banner that read, Women in Leadership Voices That Reshape Tomorrow. Eleanor Hayes stood behind the curtain, adjusting the simple clasp of her bracelet. A year had passed. 12 months since she'd nearly walked away from everything, since she had been a name no one called during meetings, an afterthought in conversations, a silent architect behind the successes of others. And now, here she was, keynote speaker, note-taker no more. She looked out briefly from behind the velvet drape. James sat near the front, just a few rows back, dressed in his usual navy. In his hands, he held a paper cup, white, plain, with a sleeve she recognized. The small corner was folded, just the way she liked it. Her coffee, light roast, splash of cream, 1 sugar, nothing grand, but familiar, thoughtful. He didn't wave. He didn't mouth encouragements. He simply raised the cup a little when their eyes met. It was enough. When the announcer called her name, the applause was warm, sincere, no polite obligation, no pity. As she stepped onto the stage, heels soft against polished wood, the room quieted. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her, but Eleanor didn't feel small. Not anymore. She placed her notes down, though she knew she wouldn't need them. She began. I used to believe that humility meant invisibility, she said, her voice steady, that supporting others meant stepping out of the light entirely. A pause, deep breath. For 12 years, I told myself I was being loyal, that it didn't matter if I wasn't seen, as long as the work spoke for itself. But silence, too, is a habit. And one day, I realized I couldn't hear myself anymore. In the audience, Lily Tran sat near the aisle, now a rising team leader in product development. She held a notepad across her lap, but she wasn't writing. Her eyes were locked on Eleanor, wide and brimming with pride. Across the room, Vanessa Pratt sat stiffly beside other department heads. She no longer held the same influence. Months ago, during a quiet restructure, she had been moved laterally, still in the company, still respected, but no longer untouchable, no longer feared. Eleanor continued, her voice warmer now. It wasn't just about recognition. It was about permission. To be bold, to take space, to know that our stories, our paths, however quiet or winding, deserve a place at the table. The room held its breath with her. I want to tell every woman here, every person who's ever been made to feel like a background character in their own life, you are not a placeholder. You are the page. Applause began, not thunderous, not wild, but full of something deeper. Respect, recognition. Eleanor smiled, not at the sound, but at the stillness that came after. The kind of stillness that meant something had landed, had stirred. She closed with a quiet truth. Some journeys don't begin until you choose to walk away. And sometimes, walking away is the first step toward finding your place. As she stepped back from the podium, the applause rose again, stronger this time. And as she descended the stage stairs, James stood. He didn't rush toward her. He waited just beyond the last step, coffee still in hand. When she reached him, he offered it wordlessly. She took it, fingers brushing his. Light roast, he said softly, splash of cream, 1 sugar. She smiled, still remembering the small things, always. They didn't kiss, didn't embrace, but as they turned and walked side by side toward the back of the room, a few glances followed them, none with malice, just curiosity, warmth, and the quiet understanding that something important had happened. Backstage, as the next speaker was introduced, Eleanor found a quiet corner by the tall windows. Charleston's rooftop stretched out below, glowing in the afternoon light. She exhaled, slowly. 12 years ago, she had sat behind a table, scribbling notes no one read, running errands, carrying burdens no one thanked her for. Invisible. But now she stood with a voice that was her own, not because someone handed her power, but because she had chosen to take it. And that made all the difference. Sometimes the most powerful act of self-worth isn't shouting to be heard, it's quietly choosing to walk away from where you are not. Eleanor Hayes spent years in the background, believing loyalty meant staying silent. But healing began the moment she stopped asking for permission to be seen. Her story reminds us that it's never too late to rewrite our role, not just at work, but in life. There comes a time in every journey when we must ask, am I being valued or simply useful? And if the answer hurts, it might be the beginning of something better. This story isn't just about love or second chances. It's about the quiet strength of people who carry others for years until one day they carry themselves. So if you've ever felt invisible, know this. Your worth doesn't fade because others fail to see it. Sometimes it only takes one person who truly looks to help you remember who you are, and often that person might just be you. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. If Eleanor's story touched your heart, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring more heartfelt stories to those who need them. And if you know someone who's ever felt invisible, send them this story. Sometimes, a simple story can remind us that we matter. We're so grateful to have you here. Until next time, take gentle care